Well, hello and welcome to the 2024 Seed Savers Exchange Apple Grafting Workshop Series. You are in the second large group session of this workshop series entitled Caring for Your Young Tree. This morning, Seed Savers Exchange Orchard Assistant Zach Jacobson will be talking a little bit about orchard pest management to help you start thinking about that sort of thing a little bit. And then the Seed Savers Horticulture and Orchard Advisor, Lindsay Lee, will be walking us through how to care for your newly grafted tree in the first few years of its life. They will both have a short slideshow presentation, and then there will be ample time at the end for questions. Please note that this session is being recorded, and we will get that sent out to you in the next week. Let me start off by introducing you to Zach Jacobson. Zach has been here with us at Seed Savers Exchange for nearly 2 years and is our assistant orchard manager. Today, they're going to give a short, broad interview of a few potential orchard pests that you may want to be prepared to deal with. Zach, go ahead and take it away.
Hello, everybody, and good morning. I will attempt to do this correctly this time. Hello, welcome to Orchard Pest and Disease Management. This is kind of going to be a greatest hits, just some of the common things that we see here at our orchards. We'll just jump right in. Diseases, they're going to happen, and it's okay. So these are some of the common examples that we have here. On the left, we have cedar apple rust, which is mostly cosmetic. And that little puffball thing on the bottom left there is a gall that forms on cedar trees, and that'll spread spores to apple trees. They bounce between apple trees, then end up back at cedar trees. It's a pretty cool life cycle if you want to look into it more, if you're into that kind of thing. But we see that it doesn't really affect the tree itself too much. And then we have scab in the middle, which is they're called the frog eye leaf spots, I think, or no, that's black rot on those leaves there. But in the bottom is a painting from 1824 that features scab on some apples. And I don't know, I thought it was cool that even back then people were recognizing it, and it was prevalent, but still edible apples. And then sooty blotch and fly speck is on this leftmost or rightmost one here, which only affects the cells in the apple skin. Doesn't really do any, and you can even wash it off if you try hard enough. So what are you going to do about it? Some things to watch for. Cankers on trunks, branches, leaf spots, all those things are indicative of fungal diseases. And so what you can do about it is prune out any disease material, and burn it or remove it from your orchards. That way it can't overwinter at all. Definitely do that before spring if possible. And yeah, the mummified fruit is a big thing too, with rotting diseases. You can kind of see it too when you see a mummified fruit and then it's spreading slowly to the fruit around it. So getting those out of there early is a really good idea. And then when in doubt, if you take anything away from this presentation, is call your extension office. They're more attuned and more well-equipped to deal with your area specifically. And they have much better resources and information to help you. So yeah, we'll move on to pests. So these are some of the more common pests that we see around here. We have on the left, apple maggot. Bottom left is the maggots themselves. They burrow their way into the apple and just have a grand old meal of your fruit. And then the top left is the fly form, the adult form. Um, Codling moth, classic. If you see any of that crumbly brown frass at the bottom of your, we see it mostly at the bottom, the calyx of the apple. They go up through the bottom and eat their way out. It's a great time. We don't like them though. And then curculio beetle. They kind of make these weird mounds on when they eat on your fruit. Any kind of bumpy, it kind of looks like scab sometimes, but any bumpy protrusions on the skin will that means you got curculio potentially. And then mammals, um, voles and mice will go after your bark in the winter. So getting guards on in the fall is really important. They will girdle your trees and it will not be fun. And if it's bad enough, they can even dig up young trees um, or they'll eat the roots. And then deer will go after buds. So if you can have them have your trees in a fenced in area or make some kind of cage if possible. Um, so yeah, what do you do about this? Is more so for insect pests. The mammals were covered pretty basically there. But there are lots of traps that you can make or buy for insects. Um, the maggots will and larvae will, if you put a cardboard tube around your tree in the spring, a corrugated cardboard specifically, they'll where it gets all wavy, they'll work their way up the cardboard, and as long as you get rid of it in a week or two, um, hopefully that'll keep them away from your tree. There are these ball traps that you can get, or you can make some kind of analog of it. Of if you just cut a square of wood and paint a red circle on it and cover it in this stuff called tanglefoot. It's a sticky substance that um, will trap anything that comes in contact with it, including you. It's very sticky. But check that once a week if you can get your hands on that. And then the pheromones will attract any males, so that'll prevent mating. They'll go to the trap, get stuck, can't mate. Pest population lowered. And then jug traps are another option too. There's plenty of different concoctions out there that you can make with vinegar, some kind of oil, banana peels. If the pests become an issue, those are all great options to look into. And like I said earlier, when in doubt, call your local extension office, send them pictures. They are a great resource to get familiar with. And so this is just bullet point list of things you can do. Kind of what the even shorter version of the short presentation that I just gave. Prune out any infected wood, thin and remove infected fruit, remove fruit, mummified fruit and leaves. Any infected material should be removed or burned. And if you're pruning an infected tree, make sure you sanitize between cuts because there's a potential to spread that between trees or an uninfected part of the infected tree. Set traps for insect pests and guard your trees. And once again, please call your extension office. They're a great resource to get familiar with. And that's all I got for that.
Thank you, Zach. So we will have, as I said, ample time for Q&A at the end. That will include questions for Zach when we get there. But for now, let me introduce you to Lindsay. For those of you who made it to yesterday's session, you'll already know Lindsay Lee. Lindsay is Seed Savers Exchange's horticulture and orchard advisor. Lindsay was the Seed Savers grafting team leader here in 1989 when Seed Savers first planted trees in our heritage orchard. We're lucky to have him here still. He's here to give us today some tips on how to care for our newly grafted trees. Lindsay, I'll pass it along to you.
Good, and thank you, and good morning to everybody. So I want to take you on a journey from the day of grafting, which may have been yesterday. Some of you may be finishing up today. There's still time. Around here, I wouldn't hesitate to graft well into the middle of April. So, like I say, yeah, there's still time. When your grafts are done, what they need immediately is moisture on the roots, a humid environment in which to heal at cool temperatures. And we've gone over this a number of times yesterday, but I'm going to say it again because it's very important. I printed mine out, but here's a data sheet that was sent to you via your email that covers this in fair detail as well. And it basically, I want to take my finished grafts, wrap the roots back up in the damp packing material. I want to push all the air out that I can from this bag, and I'll tie it, twisty tie or cape or whatever, any closure at the end of this, so that the inside where the graft unions are stays humid. Just the moisture that's in this bedding will keep this part humid. And then the second part of that is temperature. Early on, they can be a little bit on the warm side, under 50 degrees for sure, probably better around 45 for a few days, but not over a week for sure, and then drop them down. And you might end up using a couple locations. I know my garage right now is running in the mid to upper 40s, and but my root cellar or my refrigerator are cooler. So I'm going to start by storing them in the garage for a few days, and then I'm going to put them in the root cellar for the duration until it's planting time. Planting time, I'd start at my frost-free date for us here in 4B. I think of it as May 15th. That's usually pretty safe. That said, I've had frost in June before, but it's pretty rare. And if that kind of thing happens, you can cover them up. So go ahead and be planting them out. I plant them a week ahead of frost-free, no problem. Get them outside and planted. I recommend planting under your nose, somewhere where you're going to see them daily. I like to put them out in the garden where I'm tending my vegetable crop, rather than up the hill in my orchard where I don't go every day. And if I plant them up at the hill in the orchard, these things are going to need weekly tending into the summer. And I don't want to have to climb the hill every day or every week to go look at them. I want them right there along next to my tomatoes. And because as they root in and start growing, I'll open this up. Ooh. Okay, here's my one tree. Every one of these little bud nodes is going to grow. And this one isn't grafted yet. So imagine here's my graft union and here's my cyanwood. All the way along here, this is going to leaf out. At that point, we start removing those. As soon as you see them, you can just push sideways with your thumb and flick them off. And when you get up above the graft union, you want to pick, I let those grow a good week or more until I see that one is stronger than the others. And I take the others off and save the one strongest one and rub the others off. So I've really removed everything but one shoot, and I let that grow. So what's happening is that all the energy, there's stored resources in this stem, in the roots, and then the roots, as soon as they start to grow, are collecting resources from the ground and pumping it up this stem. And I want it all to go out that one shoot. If you've got good fertile soil, good growing conditions, you can get a 3-foot shoot in one summer, 3, even 4-foot shoot. If your conditions are all right. Now every bud on here, besides the bud I can see here, there are secondary buds under there. So I remove this bud once, my job's not over. So secondary buds will keep coming on the rootstock as well as the cyanwood part. So I go through usually weekly and remove all that, everything I don't want, because I don't want leaves coming out here pulling energy away from this one shoot. That shoot's going to grow fast enough. It'll get leaf out quickly. It's going to start photosynthesizing and making its own energy soon enough that I don't think we need the food production that we would get if we left all these leaves on. That process is gonna continue until midsummer. So think about it. Things leaf out in the spring, and there's a rapid growth rate early on, and they're really going to town. I mean, they're right out of the chute. They're all excited about it. I guess I'm anthropomorphizing, but by midsummer, plants, their metabolism changes a bit. They start putting more energy, stored energy, back down into the root system. They're less likely to put on a lot more new growth late, and so when I remove buds, say in the early July, then they're going to slow down on putting out all these extra leaves. So that's first year. Your job is to keep all this growing out of one shoot. I guess your second level job is to protect it. Zach showed images of a vole. This is enemy number one. Voles, rabbits, and deer are the bane of us fruit tree grafters. So whatever method you choose, whether you put wraps around individual stems, or if you put chicken wire, hardware cloth, or what have you to keep the voles and rabbits out, you're also going to need something to keep the deer away. And I'm talking about our location. I know some of you probably don't have deer pressure, but everybody's going to have rodent pressure. You know, there's other things besides fencing that will keep deer away. Having outdoor dogs often keeps deer away, but my dog will lay on the porch and let the deer walk right by. So you know, there's also a neighbor of mine buys these little stakes that he sticks in the ground, and they have a scent in them. They're just battery powered. So he sets them around his tree. And if a deer walks up to it, they'll smell the scent, which is like apple concentrate, and they'll get a jolt, they'll get a shock from that. And he has trained deer. He's got an unfenced yard, a lot of apple trees. He's trained deer just to stay out by using a bunch of those. But otherwise, fencing, woven or welded wire fencing has to be quite tall. Our fences are 8 foot here around our orchards, and there's times they jump those. So really, to be absolute sure on a big fenced area, 10-foot fence is the certain way to do it. But that's a lot of expense. But I just, and I'll tell you this a number of times today, you got to protect them. I've made the mistake myself many times, put it out even for one night and go, oh, I'll get that wrap on it tomorrow, and have a rabbit chew half the bark off. They're out there, making their living, eating plants full time while you're in watching the news or fixing dinner. So everybody wants to eat these things. So first year, you're going to grow it in the garden. You can even go, a 2-year-old tree is pretty easy to dig and lift, bare root and transplant. So if you want, you can transplant them after the first year or wait a second year. And you've got that option. If you're in a hurry to get to the orchard with them, dig them after a year. If you're not, if you have more time, grow them 2 years and then move them out. Bare root moving of a tree can happen anytime the tree's dormant. You can move them in the fall, after the leaves fall, but that's going to be quite late in the fall, right before the ground freezes. My favorite time is in the spring after the ground thaws, but before they leaf out. That's also a pretty narrow window. You've got a few weeks, maybe, or a month, but lift that tree and move it to its permanent home at that time. When you do move a tree bare root, don't let that root dry out. It has to stay wet. So either get it in a trash bag with some bedding, or I like to just dunk it in a bucket of water and move it to the site, plant it. Then you've got a bucket of water there for watering the thing in anyway. Once you've got what I'm teaching you how to do is basically grow a whip, a single stem. This is small, but I'll use this as an example. A 1-year whip won't have any side branching. A 2-year whip might put side branching, just little stubs, little spurs, right near the former terminal bud. I'm probably not interested in those because they may be a little closer to the ground than I want my first branches. So whether it's a 1-year whip or a 2-year plant, usually the first spring that it's in its permanent location, I start shaping that tree. And what I'll do is I decide how far off the ground I want my first branches. This is your choice. You get to decide where those scaffold branches end up being. The first ring of branches is your choice. And all I do is decide if I want them starting at 36 inches, I'll go up to 40, 42 inches, something like that, and I'll just cut the top off. A lot of people have a misconception about cutting the terminal off a twig like that, off of a tree. But I guarantee you that this bud, I've cut a 1/4 inch above that top bud, that bud's going to go straight up. It's going to continue. The tree wants to have a central leader. But by cutting this, my energies come up this stem, hits a dead end, and these buds turn into branches, and it branches out. You're determining where that first scaffold is going to be. So we call this a heading cut. We've headed back this stem that causes it to branch. We use that in pruning methods all the time, but for shaping the tree originally, we use that heading cut. Below that cut, these buds are going to turn into branches and grow out. And when I come back the next season and these have turned into branches, then I select 3 of them or 4 of them. So I'm going to go to slides now because I have some examples of this on film. Let's see. Okay, a lot of these are just shot in area orchards. And can I just use my arrow as a pointer? This tree would have been cut off right about here. And you can see this first scaffold was developed. They chose 3 stems to be the first scaffold. And this one's only, that lowest branch is probably not 30 inches off the ground. And commercial orchards, they prune a lot. The pruning styles usually try to keep the tree low so we're not getting people so high up on ladders. My home orchard, I'm using standard trees, but I'm pruning them out flat. They're very reachable. And this is a choice you can make. This is what's called a modified scaffold tree. So you've got you've got a scaffold branches here. They let a central leader go on up, and then they cut it off here, and you can see there's another layer of branches in here. I'm not sure what's going on up here. There's some more, but this is the kind of thing we're after. And before we go any farther, these branches are held out at about a 60-degree angle. You want those branches to establish between 60 and 45 degrees from the trunk, from vertical. That can be accomplished by many ways. We often put spacers between here to push them out, or sometimes you drive a stake in the ground and tie it down. I know people that have hung weights on them, but one way or another, you get that. You don't want it growing vertical right there next to its other trunk. Oh. Here's a tree that has been pruned as an open tree, so it doesn't have a vase shape or a central leader above the first scaffold. This is young, it's loaded with fruit, it's being weighed down by the fruit load. But think about it, I prune most of my home trees as what I call vase shape. They don't have a central leader. They're shaped more like an inverted cone. That gives me sunshine all over the tree, and it gives me good sun exposure and wind exposure. I gotta learn. This example is a little odd because it's an old tree. I'm simply saying by showing you this that it's always worthwhile to prune a tree, because this one is still producing even though there's just one live shoot on an old stump. Okay, here we go back to a commercial production orchard. You see how these branches are coming out at a nice wide angle. And here, this is a secondary scaffold in here, and this is a third scaffold. You can prune a tree to look like a crowing rooster if you want. It's your choice. How you shape these things. I I hear people, we've got a little fruit growers group around here that we get together monthly and talk about growing trees. And there's people in that group that say, oh, the tree should decide how it wants to grow. And I'm like a nurseryman from way back. I say, no, you can decide how you want these trees to grow. Oh, I got it. Now this one I like because it's short. This is to me what I want in a home orchard, because this would hardly ever need a ladder. Those top twigs are probably 8 feet. And they're vegetative. Most of the production is going to happen down in here, in these branches here. So there's still a low scaffold, a middle scaffold, and a little bit more growth over that. But these are very intentional, the way they're shaped. This is a taller tree. You would need ladders to get to this, but again, you can just see it time and time again. Nice wide angles on the branching. Here's my, these are going out at a 90 degree, and I'm not in favor of that either, because think about it, that branch could one day hold 50 pounds of apples, and it's going to be hanging down at this point. Whereas a branch that's coming up here at 40 degrees, that's going to hold that. I'm so adamant about the angle of these because a narrow crotch angle right here where my arrow is pointing, if that gets too narrow, the tree grows some ingrown bark. And I know I've got some examples of it. Okay, this is more like what I do in my home orchard. My home orchard is 12 trees, so I'm not doing anything big here. But this is an open base shaped tree. There's no central leader. I pretty much guarantee you that this big vigorous stem is going to come out shortly because it's not centered in the tree. It's going to put too much weight out here on this branch. But this is a horizontal tree. I kind of like this, but you need to start your tree and know where you're going with it. My rule of thumb for pruning is it's best to prune when the branches are still smaller diameter than your thumb. If you have to make big, 1.5 to 2-inch cuts, you've taken too long to decide to make that cut. If you know where your tree is going shape-wise, you can make the cuts. If I make a cut that's the diameter of my thumb, that heals in 1 year. There's very little chance that'll get infected or that the wood will rot back into the tree. I'll have examples. Here's a nice wide crotch, and there's no ingrown bark in that. And this is a very strong connection. That branch can hold 50 pounds of fruit and not break off. Again, these are almost 90 degrees out from the tree, and they're strong joints in here, but when they get a lot of fruit on them, they may have trouble staying off the ground because that'll pull them down. Oh, now this crotch angle right here is getting a little narrow, and you'll see this kind of pile up of bark in there. And what happens is that the bark becomes ingrown down into this crotch, probably as far down as where my arrow is. Well, that's not technically connected. That's not connected in here. So imagine you could pull, again, you hang 50 pounds of weight on that branch and it could rip off. Here's a common mistake of letting a twig grow out of a crotch. That should come out of there when it's the size of a toothpick, because this now has made this crotch into two joints with ingrown bark. And so this is extremely weak. But this is Mr. Weston. He's got an antique orchard over by Milwaukee. It's now in public hands. It's a great thing. It's an old orchard. So some of these pictures are from his. See this? This is an old tree. It was grown as an open base shape because there's not a central stem here, but those are wide angles and it's a very strong joint. This is another good example of a nice wide crotch angle, no ingrown bark. Here we have, essentially no connection from this side to this side all the way down to here. This and simply caused because they didn't spread that branch out when it was young. And that is a great risk of doing this. Now this one hasn't made the tree fall down yet, but it will. So crotch angles in a young tree are very important to pay attention to. This is what can happen. I mean, this is a tree that hasn't been thinned, it's a russet, and somebody's probably growing it for cider, but which I don't care about the size of my apples in cider production, but these trees can really put a lot of weight on. So you want that structure to be there to hold it. This is what you want. I just need to say a word about thinning. The number of fruit on a given branch determine the size of the fruit. So if I have 100 fruit on a small branch, they're going to be little. And if I thin that to where I've got one apple, they say to put a fist in between every apple. So go out there after June drop and thin them, you'll get nice big apples. There we go. So there's nothing more pleasurable than going out, starting for us in late July and picking a box of apples and putting it to use. When if and when you're ever in our region, do stop by. Our orchards are always open. You're welcome to come visit if you're here after the end of July. Bring a pocket knife and taste. We get into true fall into late August and September, October. There's usually more fruit there than you care to taste, but it's pretty fun. The trees are labeled. Jamie and Zach have done a great job with that. And so we don't yet have a map so you can find a tree variety easily, but you can wander at will and taste and explore and discover. It's quite a resource. Let's see, just hang on, Janine. We might. Anyway, this is again the Seed Saver Orchard. Oh, here's a site. We talked yesterday a little bit about top working. So this tree was top worked right in here, and 2 stems grew. This is several years later, and they've actually taken those stems and wrapped them around each other. These will graft together and become one stem. It makes this stronger, is all. Here's a modern orchard. Look at those trees are a foot apart. This is where things are going with fruit production. This is a Hoke orchard up by La Crescent, and once they've harvested, they rough up the soil and run the pigs in it. That's huge to help get rid of insect and disease and quackgrass roots. Here's a tree of mine. I hung a sheet so you can see clearly. This is an open vase-shaped tree. You see in this a lot of vigorous upward growth. and I'm going to take most of that off. When I do cut a branch, I want to cut to an outside bud. If I cut that bud that's on the outside of the sweep of the branch, it's going to continue to grow kind of on a horizontal motion. Whereas if I cut to the bud that's on top of that twig, it's going to go straight up. And that's not something I want. So there's the cut, just a little, you know, 1/4 inch past the bud. So here I've gone, this is a fairly young tree. It's maybe 4 years in the ground. And now it's probably, a dozen years old. I should take these pictures again because it's really developed well. I've really thinned it out. But I'm essentially taking all the vertical shoots out. You can see, you know, there's lots of 2, 3, 4-year-old wood on here, and that's my fruit producing wood. These long, vigorous shoots don't produce any fruit. The best wood for fruit production is the stuff that's 2, 3, 4, maybe even 5 years old. When we get beyond that, we'll make renewal cuts. We'll cut back in a ways and make it grow some new growth, and that in 2 years we'll start producing flower buds. The tree's only as old as the fruit-bearing wood. So I've seen photos of trees that were 100 years old that were still producing a lot of fruit. So there's my finished product. Okay. I think that'll do.
All right. Well, thank you, Lindsay. We are now in the Q&A portion of our session here. So I know we have a lot of questions that have already come in. If you have questions, please feel free to ask them. There's 2 ways to do that. One is to type it in the chat here, and I will read the questions out loud. If you'd like to be the one to ask the question out loud, you're also welcome to do that. To do that, please use the raise hand icon. You can find that at the bottom of your screen. There should be something that says reactions. And if you click on reactions, one of the choices is raise hand. If you do that, then Zoom will tell me that your hand is raised and I can call on you from here. So let's get started. The first question I have here may actually be from Zach, or for Zach, about pests. This question is, how do I get rid of those Japanese beetles that look like ladybugs? They ate up the apples on my one tree last year. Do you have any advice about those, or Lindsay, if you do?
Go ahead, Zach, if you have an idea.
I don't think, and Jamie can correct me if I'm wrong, I don't think we've experienced any major damage from them here anyway.
Okay, I'll take
Yeah.
it then. I've worked with them in my home gardens. They really love grapes more than apples. But on small scale, you can physically remove them. You simply hold a pan of soapy water under a branch and tap the branch, and they'll drop into your water and drown. Large scale, there are traps for them, and there's a lot of debate about, do the traps they're pheromone traps, do they attract more? But I would, if I had a big problem with them, I would be using the pheromone traps. And you don't have to hang the pheromone trap in the apple tree. It can be a ways away, so you're not drawing them to the apple tree. Anyway, Jamie, did you have input there?
Yeah, I was just going to say, we also have grapes in our orchard, and I think that that's why we don't see a lot on our apple trees. But just like Lindy says, we hand pick them off, and it definitely is a lot of work, but we noticed a huge difference after doing that only twice last year.
Right. Carolyn and Tom, it looks like you have your hand raised if you'd like to unmute, and feel free to turn your video on if you like as well. And let's hear what your question is.
Thanks. My question, sorry about this. I asked earlier. I'm one of the 1045 knife work people. Is that starting now? Should I dial into that?
No, we're an hour ahead of you, it sounds like. It's
Oh, okay.
9:45 here. So you've
Got
got
it.
an hour.
Got it.
Yep.
Thanks.
Yep. Okay, next question. We have a lot of questions about planting trees in pots. So let me just kind of read some of those off and give you a minute to address a number of things here. People are wondering especially about planting for the first few years, what kinds of pots, what type of soil, what size, and the timing of doing something like that.
Okay, should I take that? I guess. I caution people about growing trees in pots. That said, I earned my living for 30 years by growing plants in pots, so it can be done. If you must, you can do it. The reason I caution you is that a plant in a pot needs a lot of care. So you're upping the input like 100-fold. If you have to water daily or every other day to keep that thing alive, that's an awesome responsibility. Not to mention, if they're going to be there more than a year, you've got fertilizing to do. You might have to repot. And I tell you this from experience. I warn against this, but I myself had 7 Asian pears, which aren't hardy here, that I had for 25 years. I would simply drag them into the root cellar every fall and drag them back out in the spring. Now, when they got to be 25-gallon pots, that was a lot of work. And when I went traveling in the summer, my neighbor had to come over and water them. And every year or two, I would pull them out of the pots and shake the soil off, put new soil in, fertilize them, and then water them every day. Thin them hard. They set a lot of fruit, so I'd thin them severely. So in growing a plant in a pot, you do not want an oversized pot to start with. You'd want these trees, if you were going into them 1st of May, I would take a pot that the roots barely fit in, maybe a 1 gallon. Would be with a tree, it's better to find a deep gallon, deeper than it is wide. And then I would use I use soilless mixes when I'm in a container. They're usually peat based, sometimes core based, but you want, or compost based. You want good drainage. That means you have to water more often, but it also means they don't get stagnant. You don't get soggy in there. The worst thing you can have in a potted plant is for the bottom to be stagnant. You'll get all kinds of mold and root rot and stuff like that going on. So you need a light mix that drains quickly. And if it drains fast enough that you have to water them daily, that's perfect. Those plants are going to need to be protected over winter because they're technically out of the ground. So you either bury them by fall or put them in a root cellar or somehow, because the temperature of that root zone in the pot sitting on the ground, we can go to 20 below inside that pot, it's going to be a killing temperature. If it's in the ground, 8 inches down in our soil, even though it's frozen, might only be 18 degrees, and that's not going to kill root tissue. So the root ball through the winter, you have to bury it in a pile of mulch, plant it in the ground, put it in a root cellar somehow, keep it from going to those extremely cold temperatures. So there's, that's just what I've just described is a lot of work to have a tree in a pot. And I know some of you have no other choice, but if you have a little garden space and some chicken wire, I'd plant them out.
Great, thank you. Is it possible to move a bigger tree after, say, 5 to 10 years? If I'm planning to move, but not in the next couple of years and don't want to keep them in pots for too long.
Yes. I have moved. I one time, running a nursery, I one time moved a guy's orchard. We balled and burlapped those trees. They were 3-4 inch diameter trunks. And other times in my nursery career, I've moved really big trees. And there again, that's a lot of work. In my perspective, right now, if I were to move and wanted to take my orchard with me, I'd graft new ones, even if they were just coming into their prime, 5 to 10 years old. I would just graft new ones and take those. But if you want those same trees, they can be moved. I've dug big trees with 5-inch diameter trunks, bare root, and moved them successfully. Tree spades, I'm not a tree spade fan. They don't get enough of the root system. The big hydraulic things.
And when planting young trees into pots, do you need to be mindful of root flare, or do you bury the rootstock closer to the graft scar?
Well, either way, I like the top of the root system to be just an inch or two below the surface of the soil. So you can look at your rootstock, and right there is the top root, and that should be an inch or two below the surface, whether it's potting soil or your ground.
Great. And is it possible, or is it okay to plant them in their forever spot right away?
Well, the only reason I suggest you do it in the garden is that, and I've had experience with this, with friends that have planted little grafted trees up on the hillside in their intended orchard and then lose them. So there's an old adage to plant a $10 tree in a $100 hole. So I'm going to go through that. If I wanted to plant them up in the permanent location after grafting, I would go up there and I'd put down layers of, I would loosen the soil. I don't like to amend the soil with anything other than some nutrients. Somebody I saw was asking about feeding a young tree, and I just described this process in the first few years of getting a lot of growth, cutting it off, making it branch. Well, you want good growth during those years. So a mild fertilizer is going to be fine in the early years. Once they're established, I'm not too worried about it. But I want it to go into loose soil. I don't want it to go into a hole in the ground full of peat or potting mix, because that's the tree's not gonna know which way to go. I'm gonna put 8 layers of newsprint down. I'm gonna mulch it. I'm gonna fence it. I'm gonna tree wrap it so it's protected from everybody. And by doing a good, a 3-4 foot circle of mulch that's not going to let grasses grow up through it to begin with, means you can walk up there and find the thing. So they will not survive on their own.
All right, thank you. I have a couple of questions here about supplies. What is the brand of grafting tape sent for the graft unions, and do we sell it here at Seed Saver?
I can take that one. So we don't currently sell the same grafting tape that we send out in your kits. I believe that there is grafting tape for sale in the visitor center if you're local to Decorah. But what we sent out everybody, it's from AM Leonard and it's called budding tape. But it comes in quite a large roll. I think it's about $50 a roll. And you can really use any paraffin grafting tape. It's more or less the same. It's just that ours is perforated.
Some
Thanks, Jamie.
nurseries that sell rootstocks through the mail offer small quantities of grafting tape. This roll that I was pulling off of yesterday has 1,600 perforated sections on it. Most of you don't need that much.
Great, thank you. We have a question from our participant who put a rootstock in the refrigerator, but unfortunately they got frozen. Are those frozen rootstock useless now?
In a refrigerator, I would guess that the temperature wasn't terribly far below 32. So I don't think they were, I don't think they're necessarily wasted. I would try them.
Great. And another participant says they found some mold spores on grafted rootstocks that have been in the fridge. Can that hurt them? Is there something to do that can revive them?
I can also take this one. Yeah, so on a lot of cyanwood, you'll see this kind of fuzzy coating, and that's completely normal and it's not mold. I'm not quite sure what it is, but it's really common on these young shoots, and maybe Lindy knows exactly what it is. So that's one thing that you might have been encountering. Then the other thing is a sort of mildew on the damp paper towel that we sent with your rootstock. And for that, I would just take it out, get a new fresh towel, and wet it and put it back in there.
Yeah, you could just rinse any visible mold off. You're at these temperatures, they shouldn't be doing that much. The pubescence she talked about on a young stem, plants that do that and have fuzzy stems, it's simply a way the plant produces a little shade for the stem. It's really typical in desert plants, but this is what it's doing. It's just shading its tender branches.
Great, thank you. Let's see. Let me move on to some questions about protecting the tree. Is there anything you'd recommend to protect trees from sun scald or wind burn? And one person specifically asking about white paint.
Well, I see trunks painted on some old orchards. I've seen it on some nut orchards out west. And that is what they're trying to do is reflect the sun so it doesn't harm the trunk. We can get what we call winter burn on a trunk here in this climate. It typically happens this time of year when we just lost our snow cover, and we still had snow cover, yet the sun's getting high in the sky, so it's stronger, and and we're still getting freezing temperatures at night. What happens is that we've got a frozen trunk structure at night. The sun comes up, hits the snow, reflects. The southwest side of the tree gets an intense dose of sun while it's still frozen. That'll damage cambium tissue under the bark, and you'll get a canker on typically the southwest side of the trunk. I've always remedied that by making sure my trunks are wrapped in the winter months, either with the paper wrap you wind around the tree or one of the plastic spiral wraps. If you live in a place where that's probable, I would just keep them wrapped. I've never used the painting method. I think old school, they used to use a lime-based paint, and it might have had other properties. I'm not sure. It's not something that I see a lot used in modern orcharding.
Great, thank you. when thinning the apples, which apples do you choose? Do you choose the largest fruit in a cluster? This person's always afraid that they might remove the wrong apples.
Do you want me to take this one?
Sure.
Yeah, so we did quite a bit of thinning last year, and each flower bud will produce up to 5 fruit if it's well pollinated. So again, it's really important to be pulling those off. And yeah, typically we'll wait till after June drop, so the fruit will already be thinned to some extent. June drop is whenever the tree naturally drops some of the fruit if it had good pollination, where there's 5 apples in one cluster. And so, yeah, you're really just picking anything that doesn't have pest damage. You can definitely choose the largest. You're really just looking at the quality, right? So if it has bug spots on it or some sort of other damage, I'd pull those off and keep the ones that look the best.
Great, thank you. Do you recommend fertilizing apple trees?
I mentioned this earlier. Young ones, I would push a little bit. But once they're all established and producing, I'm not too worried about it. The root system is so extensive. The only type of feeding I would do that then is continuing to mulch. Mulch is going to break down and amend the soil as you go. There's also work done. I've done some playing around with cover crops under the trees, and they will, the right plant can send down a deep taproot and pull up nutrients into the root zone. Things like that, or imagine a legume like a clover that might grow a few years and then perish and leave all its nitrates and stuff up near in the root zone again. So, but as far as feeding a mature producing tree, actually I feel there's the fruit's a little better if it's a little starved.
Right. Follow up to your response, I think here, Jamie, do you ever thin the flowers before they come apples?
Yeah, so I definitely wouldn't prune flowers off, mostly because you just don't know what the fruit set's going to be like. So if you go and pull off a bunch of flowers, you're removing a lot of potential from the tree. And also, we like to be friendly to our pollinators, so leaving those on as long as you can. But yeah, again, after June drop, and you can let them get quite large. We were thinning last year whenever they were about the size of a quarter, maybe a little bit bigger than that. And it seems a little counterproductive to be pulling off something after it's gotten that large, but that really gives you a better opportunity to pull off things that get early damage from pests or weather conditions.
Great, thank you.
Might add.
Yeah.
Can I add to that? There's you also wouldn't want to be pruning during the flowering time, especially if your area has any history of fire blight, because that is a time frame when the fire blight would be in the air, and you could expose wood that would accept it. Secondly, I think about thinning when I'm doing my winter pruning, and if I've thinned out, opened it up all I want, then I look at the outer branches that have a lot of fruit producing wood on them, and I think, oh, these two are right next to each other, kind of occupying the same space, so I'll take one of those off. And by doing that, I'm thinning. I've just removed some potential fruit by if we just let the scaffold branches grow out and out and out, at some point they're going to be too long, so we need to kind of keep pushing them back toward the center of the tree by doing some renewal pruning like that.
Great, thank you. I have a few questions here about planting. Can you talk through how close together the spacing for transplanting in the first year, and then again when you're transplanting into their forever home. And also remind us how far above the soil the graft union should be.
Jamie, you want that?
Sure. Okay, so the end of the question was how far above the graft union, or how deep to plant it. And my general rule of thumb is I wouldn't really plant much deeper than an inch or 2 inches above the uppermost roots. And you definitely don't want to bury it so deep that you're near the graft union, because if you plant it that deep and then soil builds up on top of it, we've had some problems where the scion wood will root, and then what should have been a dwarf tree is no longer a dwarf tree. And so you'll get a 40-foot tall full size. And so you really want to make sure that that graft union is staying well above the soil line. But again, like an inch or two above the uppermost root is my general recommendation. And then what was the other part of the question?
Spacing, both with the nursery planting and then transplanting into its final home.
Yeah, so nursery spacing is pretty generous. I usually plant 1.5 to 2 feet apart, but really whatever you have space for, they can grow pretty close. But think about digging them out, and if those roots get intertwined, will it be difficult to get them back apart? But yeah, I'd say anywhere between 1 foot and 2 feet is just fine. And then once you plant them out in their permanent location, again, it's a little bit up to you. It depends on how much and how aggressively you're going to prune them. But I would go about 15 to 20 feet apart for an M7.
Great, thank you. It looks like there's a few pest questions here. The first one is, what do you recommend for leaf pests on new grass?
Um, probably similar advice, I think. Set traps. There's some companion plantings you can do that'll lure pests away, but you'd have to look more into that on your own, I think. But yeah, just really babying those new trees in all regards, I think is just a good thing to do.
Great.
We've grown a lot of these grafted trees out over the years, and we've rarely had much trouble with a tree that young, except for the rodents.
Yeah. Do you ever mesh bag your fruit to guard against pests?
Yeah, here at the farm we do not. So there's a couple reasons. One is that we're dealing with 25, 30-foot tall trees, and so it would be tons of bags. And another reason is just that our orchard isn't a production orchard. So for a home, for a home orchard or a few trees, that might make a lot of sense for you, especially to avoid using any sort of chemicals on your property. But yeah, we personally don't use them because of the labor involved, and we're not a production orchard. So if our fruit isn't quite perfect, that's still okay for us. But yeah, I have heard of people having good success with that, and you can, certainly go that route if you're willing to bag up all your little apples.
To fill in on that, some people might not be aware of that. You can purchase little bags that you put over the fruit. After June drop, once you thin, you put this little bag. It's got a cinch cord on it or something, and it covers the fruit for the summer. And during the insect pest problem, or insect and disease vulnerability time, and then what I've heard about them is that you end up actually taking them off late summer so that sun can get to the fruit and ripen it. And then some, I've heard about also then they might put that back on for a container for shipping, if for commercial, for really premium fruit. But it's a lot of work. But totally chemical free though.
Great. I have a lot of questions about pruning here, so I'm going to move in that direction. Let's see. Can we prune now in the spring? And there's a couple questions about that. One of them is specifically asking pruning mature apple trees in Wisconsin.
Jamie?
Yeah, so general advice, especially for someone who's just starting out with pruning, is to prune during the dormant season. So we usually start beginning to mid-February, and we'll go until typically the first week of April. But this year it was so warm, we actually stopped about the first week of March. So really hitting that February, March timeline if you're a beginner, and if you're in a similar climate to us, that would be great. You don't want to prune really early, at least if you're taking off a lot of wood, like on an older tree, because you have the risk of winter damage. Yeah, and then in terms of pruning an older tree, I would definitely start small, but one thing that you can always do, whether it's pruning season or not pruning season, is take off any dead wood. Dead wood can be taken off all year round, and that's really a good starting point for a lot of older trees that have been neglected. We actually have one on a piece of our property that's over by a cabin, and me and Zach went out last year and spent about 2.5 hours only taking off dead wood. So you really can see a big improvement with your trees just by starting with that.
Thanks, Jamie. And I'll say there are a few questions here about pruning neglected overgrown trees or inheriting trees that haven't been pruned. Do you have anything else to advise people who are in that situation?
Yeah. So I think it's quite a daunting task to look at a huge neglected tree and think you have to prune it. You can spend an entire day or multiple days pruning one tree. But yeah, my general advice I think would be deadwood first, crowded, crossing, and diseased. Those are the four categories that we're going for. So dead, crowded, crossing, diseased. And if you start with that, you should have a really good start for your tree. And yeah, I wouldn't worry so much about the structure. I would worry more about pruning for airflow and again for any dead or diseased wood. And that will really improve the health of your tree. And you can worry about structure more later as you year to year see improvements.
Great. And can you train a tree with pruning if it hasn't been pruned in a few years? If so, what's the best way to do that?
Yes, you definitely can. So something Lindy was talking about our local pruning group, and we go out and prune trees together. And something I hear again and again is look at the tree and what one cut would make the biggest difference. So if you have some weird thing growing right up through the middle, I would say cut that first. And that will be a really good start, especially for structure. If you have just an odd branch going straight up, you don't really want that unless it's the central leader. But yeah, I think it really depends on the size of the tree, and pruning is really nuanced, but you're certainly able to retrain a neglected tree or a tree that hasn't been pruned in a few years. But again, sticking to the rule of don't really take off more than 30% of a tree's wood year to year. That can be bent a little bit, but if we take off half the tree, it might look really good whenever we first do it, but then you go back in the late summer and it'll look like a bush because it's trying to put on everything that you cut off. So try to be gentle. It will take a few years to get it quite right. But yeah, make the one cut that makes the biggest difference and assess how much more you're able to cut staying within that 30%.
I have someone referring to that 30% rule asking if storm damage would count towards that 30% rule.
Yeah, I think I would count storm damage, assuming that the damage was on live wood. Any dead wood I don't really consider to be within the 30% because it's already dead. But yeah, if you have a storm bring down a huge branch that was living, I would count that in your 30%. And then I might not do much pruning on that tree that year.
Great, thank you. Question here. I've heard that you can prune trees to certain heights regardless of the rootstock type. Since standard rootstocks have more longevity, would it be okay to use them exclusively and just prune judiciously to maintain a shorter tree?
That's exactly how I do my orchard. I have them on mostly on standard roots, and it's on a side hill, so ladders are wobbly at best, and so I'm pruning them just wide and low, and you can do that. Now, but you've got to not be afraid to cut to do that.
Great. Is there a way to fix an ingrown bark situation if you're facing that?
Take the limb off.
All right. When deciding where to head the tree, is there danger in having the first branches too low?
Well, we've been moving ours up here at Seed Savers because we had some so low that we were having trouble maintaining underneath the tree. So just to be able to get a mower under there or get in there with a weed eater. We try to reduce the vegetation every fall so that the rodents don't have so much nesting material. And we've started moving them up to where there's at least 30 inches under there, if not a little more. Mine at home, I have some trees that have their first scaffold at knee height.
Not sure if I fully understand this question, but I'm going to read it. And if I don't do it correctly, please jump in, whoever asked it. Does notching to encourage specific buds to develop into branch work hasn't worked for me 2-year-old trees? When and how during the year would you notch?
We notch when this is a method for producing a shoot where there isn't one. So say I've got a 3-year-old tree and I'm pruning it and I really wish there was a branch right here. I'll go just above it with my pruning saw and just one slice. As long as I go through the cambium layer a little bit, I'll nick that bark there. Well, my energy, my sap comes up this stem and hits the dead end, and something's got to give. So here there's a latent bud under the bark here. It sprouts and grows a branch. Often works, doesn't always work, but you can kind of make a branch grow wherever you want it if you practice that.
Great, thank you. Someone's saying that one of their old adopted trees has been ringed by woodpeckers up and down 2 large trunks. Should those be removed completely due to insects or treated in another way?
Woodpeckers are not the cause of the problem. They're a sign of the symptom. You've probably got some dying wood there that is infested with insect larvae. That's what the woodpeckers would be after. Unless they're yellow-bellied sapsuckers, which are just drilling the regular ranks of holes to make sap come out. That isn't going to hurt your tree too much, and they're just harvesting insects that are attracted to that sap. But if there's woodpeckers actually excavating into the wood to get insects, you've got dying wood. So I would probe that trunk and see where, if you can get back to where there's green cambium all the way around the cut, that's where you want to go to. Back to live wood.
Is there a problem if you have too many scaffolds in too small of an area? How much distance should there be between east-west and north-south scaffolds?
That's personal preference. I like I like a good 3 feet or more between layers. Just simply because they're gonna bush out. What you want is sun and wind to get throughout the whole tree. And think about the sun getting in there. You can have a tree producing fruit all through its structure if it's open enough. If it's a bush, to use Jamie's term, and there's not light getting into the center of the tree, you're only going to have fruit on the outer perimeter. Because yeah, you won't have fruit production where there's no sun.
Great, thank you. In the first few years, do you pluck off the blossoms on the tree?
That's sweet. I used to squeeze cider with an old farmer gentleman near here, and I went over there one year to press his apples with him, and he came right out, and this gentleman was 84 or 5 years old at the time, and he says, I just planted 7 new apple trees, and should I pluck all those flowers off for 5 years? Would that help the tree? And I had to say yes, that would help the tree. And I don't think he got to finish the project. I mean, I just adore somebody that in their 85th year is willing to plant new apple trees. So, because he's not thinking of himself.
Are there companion plants or birds or other trees that apple trees would enjoy the company of?
Yes, there are lots of options for companion plants. Something that you'll see recommended a lot is comfrey. And we actually have some in our orchard. The one thing I would caution about comfrey is that, if you read, oh, plant it around the tree, you don't want to plant right around the trunk because you really want to keep nice airflow and you want to be able to look around your trunk for things like apple borers. So try to plant where you think the canopy will be in a few years. So I like to go 3-4 feet out from the trunk, and that seems to be a good place to put a ring of comfrey. And if you're interested in learning more about this, a really great book is The Apple Grower by Michael Phillips. And he's recommended a lot in the organic or natural fruit growing community. So he has all kinds of stuff and goes a little bit more into the science of what's recommended and why we're using it.
Great, thank you.
I'll say Michael Phillips has 2 books he's written. One, The Apple Grower, the first one, and then the Holistic Orchard, the second one. They're both incredible resources for organic fruit production.
Jamie, you mentioned grapes earlier. There's someone here who has peaches and grapes and wondering if there are any diseases that can jump from one to the other that they should worry about, and any recommendations about where to find information like this about grapes and peach maintenance.
Yeah, so in terms of diseases, I'm not aware of anything between grapes and apples. But as we said, there is a problem with Japanese beetles. And usually, at least in our orchard, they get the grapes first. So picking them off is, like we said, a great way to keep them from moving to your apples. And then for peaches and also plums, you'll see a lot of pest overlap. I believe curculio and codling moth will go for both of those, along with apples. And codling moth also goes for nut trees sometimes. I've heard about it in walnut orchards. So yeah, I would say it's more of a pest issue than a disease issue. but reaching out to your extension office, especially if you live in a location where people are growing a lot of peaches and apples, I can't imagine that we would find tons of information around here because peaches aren't very common. But yeah, reach out to the extension office, and I'll just plug a website that I love to use. It's called Growing Fruit, and it's kind of a message board between different fruit growers. And if you're looking for advice for your specific climate or someone's personal experience, I really like using that website to look up like pests for apples and peaches, something like that. And usually I can find what I'm looking for.
Great, thank you. We only have 3 minutes left before we have to leave this session so we can start our next grafting coach sessions. So I got to most of the questions. I know I did not get to all of them. If you still have questions that I didn't get to, please feel free to send those questions to Jamie, and I'll list her email here in the chat. But also remember that there are follow-up sessions coming up throughout the year where we will go over a lot of this stuff as well. Before we sign off, Zach, Jamie, and Lindsay, are there anything that you want to say?
You guys?
I think that's just about covered it. But yeah, good luck with your trees. And actually, I'm just thinking, there is something that I would love to let everybody know before we log off is if you noticed on your tagged cyanwood, they're all written in Sharpie. And that is because our printer was not working. And so we had to handwrite them all. But really important to know is that Sharpie will fade in the sun. And so before you put your trees outside, you need to go on the back of your tag, which will be blank, and write the name in pencil. Because if you put it out with only the Sharpie on there, in about a year, it will be completely blank, which is something that we have unfortunately run into. And we're going to save you the hassle by letting you know, again, right on the back of your tags with a pencil.
A nice
So,
soft leaded 2 or 4B pencil will stay on there longer than any Sharpie ever will.
Yeah. I also recommend making a map that you can keep indoors separately. Great. Well, thank you all so much. Thanks for your excellent questions and thanks for being here. Again, any questions that didn't get answered, feel free to email us. I just put Jamie's email address in the chat, and she loves to hear from you. So don't be shy. Again, we'll be sharing the recording of this session with you next week. So you'll continue to have this for reference. For those of you who haven't yet had your knife coaching session, we'll see you later today. And to everyone else, we hope to see you at the next large group session, which will be all about planting this young tree or these young trees. That session will be at 1 p.m. Central Time on Friday, April 26th, and you'll receive a reminder email closer to that time as well. Thanks again for being here and hope to see you again soon.